This is the Promising Practices for Health Equity podcast, brought to you by the Interdisciplinary Research Leaders Program, a national leadership program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation.
Hello, and welcome back to Promising Practices for Health Equity, the podcast created by the Interdisciplinary Research Leaders Program, affectionately known as IRL. I'm your host, Krystal Lee, and my co-host today is J. Robin Moon, Associate Director of Research, Evaluation, and Dissemination for IRL. Hey, Robin.
Hi, Krystal. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Oh my gosh, Robin, I'm so excited to finally be kicking off season 3 of our podcast, the final season. I am so excited about it, but I also find it a little bit bittersweet. But I do think that we have done what we set out to do.
Yes, for season 3, the season we're calling Envisioning the Future. Over these episodes in season 3, we will be hearing stories told by our IRL fellows and alumni, visions for the future rooted in the deep community work they have been doing.
And to launch this season of Vision, we knew we had to begin with 2 very special guests. Today, we are joined by Luis Ortega of Storytellers for Change and Ashley Ellis of the Breathe Collective. Welcome, Ashley and Luis.
Thank you for having me.
Hello, hello.
We're so happy to have you both here with us. Very excited. Let's kick our conversation off with one of our IRL signature promising practices, checking in with each other. Well, this one's easy. It's a new year. Today is January 12th. What is your one intention for the new year? I will start. I have a few, but one intention that I've been waiting for 2 years leading into the new year to really start thinking about it every day is to be not time poor. That's a little different from just saying to be time rich. Somebody who's not from the US, who's from a Buddhist country in Asia, has referred to me, and not as criticism, not as anything, just to say, he could have said, Robin is very busy. He was talking to someone else about us, and he said, because Robin is time poor. And that did something in me. I could go on and defend myself about why, and I still enjoy my work, and I love every hour of what I do, all of that. But still, that apparently makes me time poor, and I don't want to be poor in anything. And I find it very refreshing to hear that being busy is actually not a positive, affirmative thing. So I'm going to do something about it. I think it's going to be a lot more about prioritizing what I do with my time. And I don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but that is my one intention, to not be time poor. Krystal, bounce it to you.
Thanks, Robin. I also have a couple of things that I wrote down, but I think I will share that my intention this year is that I'm going to try my best to allow myself to be taken care of. That is not something that comes naturally to me. I am an eldest child, an eldest daughter of an immigrant family. And most of the stereotypes about people who hold those identities ring true for me. And it is not an easy thing for me to release control or, just allow others to take charge. And I am intending this year to do less of what I usually do and do more of allowing myself to be taken care of. I am going to toss it to Luis. Luis, what's one of your intentions for the new year?
Yeah, thank you, Krystal, and thank you, Robin, and hello, Ashley. And I'm gonna say that for me is fluidity. So to give you some context, for the last couple of years, so much of my personal commitment to my well-being, my own healing journey, which I believe is interconnected with our larger collective healing journey, was very much grounded on a deep commitment to consistency around a variety of practices. Over the last, I would say, 9 months, a lot in my personal life has changed, which has essentially made consistency, how I've known it for the last couple of years, very difficult to continue to practice. And I noticed within me that there was a resistance to shift these practices that had really offered me so much well-being. And I realized that part of what I had to do was not so much compromise on the consistency of the practice, but to embrace fluidity. Meaning, how do I move in new ways that allow me to continue to bring those practices into my life, but within very different contexts, geographical contexts, material, physical, emotional, spiritual. And there is a contemplative place where I've been holding on to that fluidity that has allowed me to find a space for hope. Some of the most pressing tensions and questions that I've experienced over the last couple months, this space of fluidity has allowed me to be more at peace with them. So I'm moving into 2026, really thinking about how do I embody more of that in my life. And Ashley, I'll pass it over to you.
Hey y'all. Glad to be here. One intention that I have for the new year, and I'll probably just keep it simple, is to live more fully, more embodied, more connected, more aligned, so that I can feel more alive. When everything else is falling to the wayside, to just be fully present to this life and in my body. So that's my intention, is to just be more connected, more embodied, more aligned.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to almost sit here and think about what you just two said without moving forward for now. Make me think, as you always do, Ashley and Louise. Okay, so before we dive into this episode, Krystal and I wanted to share a little bit of the why behind this conversation, why we brought you two together for this season opening episode. Krystal, would you like to start?
Yes, I would. How did you know? As we've mentioned, this season of the podcast is about envisioning the future. The stories that will be shared in the episodes in this season are from IRL fellows and alumni as they envision the future. Their visions for the future based on the community engaged, community centered, community led research that they have been doing, the lessons that they learned and talked about in season 2. So I asked myself, why are the stories important? And the answer is something that I learned from Luis, which is that stories are directly connected to the systems around us, right? I am clear that stories told over and over become narratives. Narratives spread over time become mental models, and mental models become the foundation for the systems that we create. So if we want to change or shift systems, storytelling has to be part of that process. So then the question becomes, what are we shifting these systems towards? It's not enough to be anti something, as Sean Jean Wright suggests. We must have a vision or an intention for the change that we want. And for me, that's where Ashley's work comes in. For me, restorative justice principles have created the space, a world where everyone feels like they are part of a community, where their needs are met, where people and relationships are centered and prioritized, which is something that we heard from a lot of our teams in season 2 about relationship, community, and trust being important elements of the community-led, community-oriented research that they were doing. And so I see this as a completely new way of being. And I thought it would be helpful for us to set the stage for the stories that we will share, the visions of the future that our IRL fellows and alumni will share with us in their stories, by having this conversation with Luis and Ashley about where does narrative change, storytelling for narrative change, and restorative justice intersect.
Yes. And because what became overwhelmingly clear in season two, and really even starting with season one and every single episode, literally, is that relationships and building such human relationships are the key ingredient for meaningful change in the community and at the systems level, like the necessary ingredient that makes the dish that we want to cook. The kind that academic journals rarely talk about as evidence for successful research and community engaged research. And restorative practices teach us how to be with one another, how to build relationships. And Luis taught us how individual stories told and retold over and over again change narratives and systems, like Krystal, as you say. Basically, individual transformation and systems change are inseparable is one of the main learnings we've had. As Adrienne Marie Brown suggests, we can grow a compelling future together through relatively simple interactions. We can intentionally change in ways that grow our capacity to embody the just and liberated worlds we long for. It's in her Emergent Strategy book, page 24. RJ, or restorative justice or restorative practice, is how we get to these just and liberated worlds. That's one of our major learnings. It is the path we travel where we figure out how to be in community and in relationship as opposed to do great programs and implement structures or whatnot. We have learned that experientially through our journey over the last few years that individual transformation, again, is completely tied to system level transformation. So that is why opening this season with you two feels really essential.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks for sharing that. I think it does. We've done a pretty good job of setting the stage. And so I want to ask you our first question, Robin. Why did IRL, as a leadership, as a research program, seek out RJ training and storytelling training? What was happening and what was the gap that we were trying to fill in the program?
I love telling these stories, and I'll be as brief as I can because I'm anxious to hand it over to our guest here. The story is really about two things. One, a desperate realization that we needed to change something more fundamental than trying different programs, modalities, frameworks, and models, or even like different leadership, like individuals, as you know, in the leadership. And I do want to preface this by saying, like, this is not unique to IRL program or any other programs or organizations. I think that we were able to, and with the pandemic as a backdrop or foundation and backdrop, all of it, we were really able to see something fundamental needs to change. Otherwise, nothing is going to change in the way we're doing things. So otherwise, we would be just treading the same water all the time. That's number one. Number two, a very humble realization that things could come together without one's, individuals or specific person's own effort necessarily. But it's really when one curbs their ego and keeps the intention very strong without really trying so hard to do things. And that's when we met Ashley, and like the way that she came about was also pretty, I think, emblematic of this whole point of the story, which it was an accident. We had a restorative justice webinar that we're gonna put on, and it was a last minute cancellation. And I think it was really within a day, like the day before the webinar, Ashley came to substitute, replace this cancellation. And we met Ashley, and I think all of us at the National Program Center went, we need more of Ashley. We're going to talk about, I hope you will all talk about how it all went, but the way that Ashley introduced restorative practice as not crisis management, which I knew very little about restorative justice going in. I thought it was something, it's a way of dealing with the problem when there's actually a problem already at hand. She taught us that it is ways of being with one another in community. And her introduction of Adrienne Marie Brown, specifically her Emergent Strategy, her book, and Sean Jimwright and his book, Four Pivots. Those languages, it's not that we didn't have it among us. We had them sort of in theory, intellectually and academically. Ashley really walked us through to show us what that actually looks like in action. And then Luis came around when we started looking, I think it was early summer of 2024, when we're planning, Krystal and I were planning for the 2024 annual October leadership meeting for the IRL. We were by then already very much into restorative practices. And I was very obsessed with how to practice more of it. And we knew it had, something to do with story circle, something to do with story. And the way that I personally have heard about storytelling in like a social research world, or social even justice within public health world, was either really academic, like oral history, and research around like ethnography and research around storytelling, and with storytelling as a method, or something more, again, this is my impression, like woo woo, like tell stories. Like I did not have a way to connect how that was actually going to be a vehicle to change our society and ourselves. So we were looking, and long story very short, we're like, we're gonna invest money. We're gonna invest the money that we have to really find quality storytelling trainer for the workshops we would offer for the fellows. We met with a number of different organization individuals, and we realized rather quickly that storytelling like skills and techniques were not what we really needed to offer. What we really needed to offer is how to use the storytelling in the community, and two, how to co-create stories that is not about like a stand-up, like a TED Talk or situation. And three, stories of not past or the present, but the future with critical hope. And lastly, the goal of changing what is beneath the narrative, to how to change the mental model. And I didn't have these language around what I just brought it up until we met Luis. And Luis was the one that we had to bring in. And he also spoke the language of Sean Jim Wright, Adrienne Marie Brown, and others like Marshall Gant. We knew that we found the right person, and the rest is history. I try to make it really brief. That's the best I could, Krystal.
And we will leave it at that. Ashley and Luis, how about you tell us what called each of you to this work with IRL? Why did you say yes to us? Let's start with Ashley.
So I didn't know what IRL was when I was invited to do the webinar. I got a call from a good brother of mine who, when he usually asks me things, it's a yes, even without knowing. And so I was like, yeah, I don't know what this is about. And if you're inviting me, it's only one thing, not one. I can talk about many things, but the work that I am embedded in is grounded in restorative justice. And so I showed up with what I had. um, Not knowing how it was really, going to be received or anything like that. And so, but I said yes to him. And because, he was a yes for you all, I showed up and I did what I have been called to do. But when you all reached out after the fact to ask me to come in, I thought that it was initially just about, doing an RJ training with you all. And I think that I had the opportunity to sit with the team at the time to really get a sense and a feel. And it was in those moments that I recognized that what you all were asking me to do you actually needed work that was deeper than just that. And in those moments is what I said yes to, because I saw a community that wanted to be different with one another, to have something different happen in the larger context of the community. And I wanted to support you all in doing that work, because I felt like that was going to be essential to whatever you had imagined you wanted to do. It would have to start with you all. It would have to start with the relationships. And so I wanted to say yes to that journey with you all, because I knew that it's what, sometimes you can go in a room and folks are requesting a service or something of sorts, and you're like, I think you just want the information, right? Like you just want to know how to do a thing. And I think that was what you all sensed into. But when I sat with you all, what I felt and was interpreting is that you wanted more, but you didn't have the language for that yet. And so that's why I said yes, because I could sense the commitment that you all had, not only to the process, but to one another and to the greater community. And so, yeah.
Man, you said you showed up with what you had, and it was exactly what we needed. How about you, Luis? Tell us about your journey, your decision to say yes to us.
Ashley already articulated this in such a beautiful way. So I'm gonna build on what Ashley offered because it resonates deeply. And I was trying to think about our first conversations over Zoom, as many of my conversations usually are at the beginning when I'm meeting a potential new partner or organization or client, collaborator. And really, I think what I'm interpreting from Ashley's, or an element that I'm interpreting from Ashley's answer to the question, which resonates with me, is that it was really a continuum, and that from the beginning all the way through our first in-person engagement, facilitating a storytelling workshop, supporting a story jam session, and I'll say more about the story jam session later, that there were a variety of affirmations. And I think another way of saying this perhaps is that I'm a firm believer in reciprocity. I'm a firm believer in Lakesh, the Mayan concept, you're my other me. And I think there's something that I've learned to understand or notice in my conversations with organizations and collaborators over the years. This idea, and again, building on Ashley's language here, right, that you do get a sense for who is seeking just content or information and who is seeking relationship and transformation. And from the very beginning, I just sense a reciprocal curiosity in each other's work. I sense from your questions that there was a deep interest in wanting to understand storytelling beyond performance. And not to say that performance and storytelling don't have a role to play in our social justice work, but really this question of how are stories interconnected with our systems change work? What is the role of storytelling in an academic context that also transcends quote unquote academic frameworks, right? And or more traditional ways of thinking about where story should be placed in an academic context, and how do we lean into the embodiment of narrative? How do we lean into understanding what is our personal commitment to transforming ourselves in the larger context of systems change work? And how do we not just make it an analytical exercise, but a deeply personal one? I sensed a lot of these from our first conversations. And I say it was a continuum because one thing is to sense and to begin to have an inclination towards saying there's something powerful that's emerging here. Another thing is to then show up and seeing people embodying that curiosity, right? That moves beyond the transactional. So for me, time and again, how you, Krystal, how you, Robin, showed up in the context of the relationships that we've been building since then, since collaborating, how many others in the IRL community showed up, how I was welcome into the space. All of that and so much more, time and again, led me to say yes to the work and to say yes to show up as authentically and courageously as I could.
Thank you all for sharing your decision-making process. It's pretty well aligned with my experience of your joining our team. I wonder if you could help us and our listeners kind of weave the threads together. So can you both talk about where restorative justice and narrative change meet, and kind of how are they in conversation with each other?
Ashley, I was actually curious if I could ask you a question
Sure.
to get this started. And I'm wondering, could you tell me about the story behind why you do what you do right now? Like,
Mm.
why do you do restorative justice?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll thank you for asking for the story. So I'll give a quick synopsis of what I think is probably two parts to this story. Is when I was in college, I really had a transformative encounter. I was a sports management major. But my heart always knew I wanted to work with young people, and I had to keep a scholarship I had. This is my freshman year. I had to take like one more credit, and I took this juvenile justice seminar. And the second day of the seminar, our professor took us to Joliet IYC, which was like considered like a maximum secure juvenile kind of prison. And it was like my first, yeah, I was the only young woman on the taking the course, and I was the only Black person. And I remember touring the facility, and these young people, saw a young person. I remember him being like 10 or 11 at the time, shackled. And a part of this tour, they was like, do y'all want to see what was considered like the SHU? It was solitary confinement. And my mind couldn't wrap around children in solitary confinement. It didn't make sense to me. And so as we are journeying to the SHU, I thought it was going to be empty, because why would you take people to see young people in these cages? But to my surprise, we're on this unit, and each set of doors I pass, another face appears. And it literally felt like something out of a movie, because I was like, maybe this is not real. But by the time I get to the end of the unit, I look down and there is nothing but Black and brown faces at the doors. And something shifted in me then. It was like, you have something to do with these young people. And I really didn't know what it was, but what I did know was that they were trapped inside of this system. And when I say system, structurally, not just inside of this literal institution, but I think like the systems that destroyed our neighborhoods too. Because I was hearing stories of young people who would get off, they would get sent home on a train, and they would commit a crime when they got to the city just to be sent back because they had nowhere to go. And it really shifted in something in me. And I was like, there has to be a more healing paradigm that interrupts this cycle before they even get here. And I didn't know what that looked like. And I met a good brother, Mashawn Hendricks, who was my big brother's friend. And long story short, he introduced me to some people working with young people. And they asked me to take this training, this restorative justice training. I was like, I don't know what this is. And Cheryl Graves, Pamela Purdy, Aura Shrub of Chicago, that's where I'm from. I took this training with them, and it was like a fire had been lit. And I was like, this is it. To sit in a process in a circle and to understand for the first time what it fully meant to be seen, to have space to tell your story, to have space to understand why someone has done what they've done, and to understand that as a whole person, you're not just what you did. It was transformative for me. And I was like, I remember the last day a woman walked up to me from the training, because it was all these mothers who were part of this training from the south side of Chicago. And she said, "This is going to be the work you do." And I didn't know, because nobody I knew had ever really been doing this work in the world. But I knew that, like, whatever I touch, I want to do it in a circle. Whatever I do, I want to do it like this, because I felt myself being transformed in that moment. And I knew that if it could happen that way, that on a larger scale, we could transform communities. We can transform the lives of young people if we gave them space. And so I think that, like, that was why I started doing the work that I was doing, because Octavia Butler says, "All that you touch, you change, and all that changes you." And I was changed. And I knew that the little girl in me needed this, and so many other young people. And the more I did it, I realized, like, oh, this is for all of us. And so that's the story of how I got into restorative justice, and why I fell in love with it as a process, as a way of being, as a tool for liberation and freedom, and as a different paradigm for what our young people could encounter, before they reach the system.
Ashley, thank you so much for sharing that story. And I'm not surprised to learn that you and I share a lot in common. A lot of similarities in the narrative arc that you're sharing.
Mhm.
I oftentimes think about the power of storytelling as a
Mhm.
time traveling
Yes.
conduit mechanism, and you had me traveling as you were sharing. And of course, I mean, at the same time, we do have different positionalities, and there's different ways that I'm sure that you and I experience the world. But the places where I just found some immediate commonalities, and that I think invite me to also and answer this question around where does storytelling, narrative change, restorative justice intertwine? Well, first and foremost, in the embodiment of what you just did, right? Like you sharing a story about your own journey of transformation, and rooted on healing, rooted on reciprocity, rooted on feeling whole and well and in just relationship. And for me, giving a narrative, right, to that process that allows us to metabolize it, that allows us to see it as core to who we are, past, present, and future, is so essential to healing. I, not unlike you, envision myself also working with young people when I was young. That kind of comes from my ancestry, because I come from a family of educators. So I always envision myself as an educator. Nevertheless, as an undocumented person in this country, the pathway into being a classroom educator was just not there for me.
Mhm.
So I found other ways to do youth work and education work. And in many ways, my pathway, above all, was through community organizing. And I used to think I arrived into community organizing work from a place of anger, right? Experiencing um, and not to say that there was no anger, or that there was no fear, or that there was no tremendous trauma along my journey, facing all kinds of injustices, all kinds of marginalization, just witnessing all kinds of horrible things happening to immigrant communities, to Black and Brown communities, to queer communities. I mean, that anger was there. But I think really above all, what was there for me was I believe in dignity. Like
Mhm.
just deep down, I believe that it shouldn't be that way. I think early on in my community organizing work, I envisioned storytelling first and foremost as an act of resistance, as an act of defiance, to say these this way in which you've structured schools, this way in which you've structured how we conceptualize quote unquote public safety, this way in which you've conceptualized who gets to have access to healthcare, and this way in which you conceptualize who gets to have an ID that allows them to claim belonging and or access to any type of public service. Just it really a call to say that's broken. That's not holding all of us. And unfortunately, while there was some sense of empowerment in getting them engaged civically, and a lot of my community organizing work early on involved working with other young undocumented people. And so many of our stories follow a very similar narrative arc. And it was always, at the time, it seemed to me like this plea for belonging, right? Like, let us belong with you in these systems that you've created. And if you make these adjustments, right, then we could graduate from high school. We could go to colleges. We could have access to healthcare. We could have driver licenses. We could. And these persistent resistance to being dehumanized and persistent resistance to being told, no, get out of here, right? You don't belong here. And this pleading for allow us to show you how we can embody the proverbial American dream. There was empowerment in that, but there was also a lot of numbness. There was also a lot of disassociation. There was also a lot of compartmentalization. There was also a lot of trauma. And it was very confusing for me as a young person. I'm like 17, 18, 19. I'm working with others to tell these stories in front of our senators or representatives, city council, school boards. And we are, by the way, getting some tangible material policy changes done. And I was so confused how these small victories and these moments that felt so empowering, telling our stories, at the same time had me feeling so numb, so disconnected. And I began to realize that storytelling as resistance, while important and part of our legacy, it's not ultimately, it's not ultimately what's going to hold us. Because I don't want a life of resistance, right? Like that's not ultimately what I want. I don't want a life of performance also. I don't want to have to perform for a system to see me and acknowledge finally that I'm what I've always been, human and whole and worthy. And I saw that happen so much with so many other young people that I was working with. And again, not unlike you, it was in a circle. Uh, in not in a legislative setting, not in a public hearing. It was in a circle, in a forest, in a retreat, being held by educators who were deeply committed to liberation, who were deeply committed. Before I had this language, right, like restorative justice, belonging, like that embodied that, right, and held space for me to feel seen and to feel whole for the first time in a long time. And the shift for me in that moment, right, being in this circle, was essentially saying it's not storytelling as a practice of resistance that we need to be committed to. It's a storytelling as a practice of liberation.
Ashe. Mm-hmm.
And that requires healing.
Yes.
So that to me is where it intertwines, right? That narrative change. And my biggest critique, right, of narrative change efforts that I see in our larger ecosystem is that many of them are very obsessed with what is the right message, right? Or what is the right story, quote unquote, that's going to get us to um, achieve that particular narrative shift that we may want in a particular context. And there's the relational, right? It's not there. So it requires healing. So for me, restorative justice and narrative change are intertwined if we are deeply committed to liberation.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for naming and for sharing that story. I think since the moment I've encountered you, even without knowing you, and I've have felt deeply aligned and interconnected. I think our souls know one another from the past or something. I feel every time I'm with you, I feel like I know you know you, But when you talk about like storytelling as resistance, but not just as resistance, but as a tool for liberation, for healing. One of the things that came to my mind is Lucille Clifton has a poem, I think it's called Sometimes They Be Mad. But in the poem, there's this piece that in it, if I'm remembering correctly, it's like they ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories, and I keep remembering mine. And I think about storytelling when you talk about as healing, it is a storytelling really is an ancestral technology that calls us into remembrance, right? When colonization has told us a narrative about ourselves, storytelling becomes the way that we get to return back to ourselves, right? That we get to remember that life beyond struggle, resistance, right? Life beyond oppression, life beyond, and we get to take back, right, our power too in the way we tell our story by practicing it. I always talk about how when I first got introduced to this work, it was not, and I think they were intentional, and I give homage to my elder, Cheryl Grace, Pamela Purdy, or Shrub, or Shub, who when introduced to this work, it was not introduced to me as restorative justice. It was a peacemaking circle training, right? We were in this practice of circles. And the thing that drew me in was the stories. Seeing, literally witnessing people shift in their seats about the way they told a story. You know, that one day you can show up and tell this story and with your whole heart see yourself one way, right? For an example, right? You may see yourself as somebody who feels powerless. And by the time we finish this process, you can tell this exact same story in a very different way and understand how powerful you are, right? Because you're remembering, right? That this is a technology. And that's why when you say, like, I think any tools that are used for liberation can also be used for oppression, even the circle. If not done with intention and if not done with spirit. And so when I think about the interconnection of these two, I think that um, in indigenous practices, justice came by way of relationships and story. And, you know, we're in a new time and we're remembering what has always been in new ways. And they are meeting each other, right? And I think activating something within our communities that says that not only do we get to be warriors, the resistance, but we also get to be healers. And I think that Dr. Fania Davis talks a lot about that as well in her work as a restorative justice practitioner, advocate, that like we can't just be warrior, but we also have to be healer, and that they get to be two sides of the same coin. So all that to say, thank you for bringing that into the space. And so, yeah, I'm digress there.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And again, so yes, our souls have known each other. That much I know. And I think once again, I mean, there's so much that you're offering that deeply resonates with me, and I'll briefly connect it to part of the introduction that Krystal did at the beginning of the podcast around my thinking and understanding around how stories, narratives, systems, structures, mental models, how all of that is connected, right? And I think back to your story that you were sharing with us and your reaction to seeing the violence of a carceral system, right? Like materially, structurally, right there. And I think about, right, like what are the stories that told over time became narratives,
Mm-hmm.
cross generations became mental models that combined with material power turn into structures and policies and systems that make it possible for children, and especially Black and Brown children, to be caged. as a matter of legal practice, backed even by a moral claim. I mean, I think about so much of what's unfolding around us right now and the narrative behind it that does claim to use quote unquote moral language and legal language. This is what's right for quote unquote us language that justifies the disappearance of people, the public execution of people, the removal of people. And across history, that practice has been there since colonization times. And that's the place, right, where, to your point, like we do need resistance, right? We do need those stories that remind us, first of all, that resistance has always existed, right? This has never been a passive process. It's never been, here's the brutal, violent dominance of a group, and then things just went forward from there. There's always been a pushback. There's always been a movement that calls into question that tremendous act of violence and pushes back against it. And the difficult balancing act there is, how do we fight while at the same time hold on to our humanity? When I say humanity, I mean our collective humanity. That's perhaps like one of the most persistent ongoing tensions that I faced in my work. I so appreciate you naming that many of these tools, strategies, tactics, practices, right, that we bring into our work with the intention of liberation and care and just relationship can also be deployed to harm, to destroy, right? That like a circle facilitated with the intention of remove humanity follows many of the same facilitator moves that I would use to create a circle that restores us into each other, right? And restores us in humanity. So I always oftentimes think of stories as fire, right? Like fire can be nourishing. Fire can be, it's intertwined with our history as humanity, right? It's ancestral. We gather around fire to tell stories. I like to imagine that the first story ever told happened like that. A group of people around a fire telling a story about what unfolded, and then memory began, and everything else began to unfold since then. And across so many indigenous cultures, like there's these beautiful interconnection with fire, right? Like the fire keepers who does that, who tends to it, and fire can destroy.
Yes.
So for me, it's a question of who wields it, who wields the fire, and a sacred responsibility that I hold on to, and that I'm perpetually in tension with. And I want to be clear that when I say tension, I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing for me to experience these tensions and ask myself critical questions about what does it mean to facilitate this work, knowing and holding myself accountable to this work and to liberation. And this is where, and I wonder perhaps like if you could then tell me what holds you as you do this work, because if we are keepers of fire, right? And if we are keepers of these approaches and practices that we know can bring healing, what is the principle or what grounds you as you do the work to remain rooted in the practice?
So two things come up for me. One of them is the ancestors, my ancestors. Anytime I'm doing this work, I do it in my circle and RJ lineage, but I also do it within the lineage of my bones. And so when I think about who I am accountable to, I'm first accountable to the people I come from, right? Yeah. And I when I say I don't have a process that is absent of spirit, is because they are the ones who I call in to support me in these spaces. And that may be different for some people, right? But I wouldn't do anything, one, that disrespects my lineage or the lineage of anybody who is present in the room. And I think the second thing is, and this is something, a principle that I also brought to IRL, is that I don't ask folks to do nothing that I'm not willing. And so accountability for me is that if I'm in a practice with you, right? I'm not doing this if I'm in a practice with you, I also have to be willing to engage in the same, right, critical reflection. I have to be willing to engage in doing whatever the hard thing is. I have to be willing to be held accountable when we're doing this. And I think that when we started the IRL work, it was something that I really wanted to not just tell them, but embody, that this isn't something that you're doing for the fellows or for IRL. If you're not willing to engage in it yourself, then to have an expectation for somebody else to do that and then wonder why things aren't working when you're not working it either. For me, I think that is something that holds me, right? Is that I have a responsibility to this fire. But to know this fire, I have to know my own. I have to know my own fire, right? Or else the responsibility that I have is that I'll burn myself and other people who are in the room. And now, where this tool, even by me, being held, not just a tool, but this practice that is held by even me, if I'm not accountable, then I cause more harm than good. And now you're experiencing what now can be a tool again, right? Of oppression. You're experiencing something that is going to cause harm, right? If I was somebody who took the stories of the folks in circle and I go tell them to somebody else or write about them and being extractive, right? That's a tool of colonization. That's what they've been doing, right? And so we can replicate those if we aren't doing the work ourselves. And for me, I always try to, in my community, I have folks who are in the rooms with me too. So like if I'm doing something that I wouldn't do, like they get to call me in as well, and so I want to be accountable to the people I come from, the people I stand with, and I want to be accountable to myself, knowing that I'm not doing harm intentionally, to anyone who has trusted me with this process, trusted me with a circle, trusted me with their yes. And so that's how I hold that.
Thank you, Ashley. And I cannot help but to want to invoke Dr. Sean Ginwright and Adrienne Mary Brown as I reflect on what you're offering, because what's coming up for me and part of what grounds me as I do the work, and I want to connect this also to the Story Jam sessions that were part of the gatherings that we co-facilitated with IRL fellows, is the importance, in the language of Dr. Ginwright, to do mirror work. Is that critical reflection work that you are referencing, Ashley. And in the Nahualin, which is the four movements in the language of my Nahuatl ancestors, one of those critical four movements we call the smoking mirror. And for me, the smoking mirror is that place not only where we seek to see ourselves, but pay attention to that word we seek. Is a practice. It's not the idea that the mirror just immediately gives you the answer. It is a journey, right? To seek into the smoking mirror, to seek my humanity, to seek each other, right? To seek our growth, our hurt, our possibility, our ancestors, right? Our past. I think also what's profound for me about this pivot, right, as Dr. Sean Ginwright tells us in his book, from lens to mirror, right, and this is where I think, like, one of my critiques, right, of what so often happens in the social sector, what so often can also happen in philanthropy, what can so often happen in academic institutions, is just this reverence for the lens approach, right? like paralysis by analysis, right? Like
Mhm.
it was the let's study, let's refine, let's refine. And this is not to say, right, like once again, I do believe that there is a place for analysis. I do believe that there is a powerful commitment that we need to make to ongoing thoughtful academic research. Like I do believe that is necessary. But one thing is to acknowledge that as a practice out of many others. Another thing is to build like a dogmatic commitment to it to the point that you remove yourself and even the people who are most impacted many times by these practices from the action, right? So the reverence of the lens at the expense of people and relationship and community causes so much harm. And I think the same thing happens to how we tell our stories. Like this is where I see a lot of people applying a lens to their life experiences to analyze it, and then let me put it together in a nice formula so I can give you a 2 to 3 minute, 5 minute speech, instead of sitting with the more worthy but also challenging question of acknowledging I'm a vibrant being that's here because of generations and generations of stories. And what will I contribute to this legacy at this moment? And what does that mean for what comes next? And for me, I deeply believe in this approach to narrative. And what part of bring this back full circle, what had me saying yes to this work is just sensing that the IRL community was ready for a moment of emergence, right? Bringing Adrienne Mary Brown here into the space and their language around fractals, right? Like just how these micro elements of us embodying possibility, change, liberation, justice, healing can give us, right, not only the reason to hope, but very material, tangible changes upon which we can build and then create systemic structural change. And for me, story is essential to that. And the story jams, both story jams that I had an opportunity to contribute to, for me, a lot of what sustains me over time is seeing that once you create that container where you offer a group of people a healing centered approach to connect with their stories and each other, right? To engage in that reciprocal act of story listening and story sharing, and then create a container where they can open their hearts. They can invite us into their past and their present and their future. They can invite us into their fears and they can invite us into their grief and their pain, but also their joy. That witnessing, right? That moment to me, what you were referencing earlier, Ashley, right? Like when you're in a circle and people are shifting and you see them leaning, or sometimes you just feel like the group is holding its breath, waiting to hear what's going to happen next, right? Like
Yeah.
I felt that at the IRL convenience. And above all, I felt it in so many different interactions, but collectively, right? Like I'm always in awe when a whole group can hold a moment, can hold a person, right? And these moments, the first story jam, I just have to say, it was interesting because as a facilitator, like I remember we had a fellow, and I will not go into the details of their story because that's their stories, but a fellow opened up with a poem, and the poem was so powerful, so beautiful, so compelling, and this fellow got a standing ovation. And then I remember thinking, it's going to be interesting to see what comes next, and will we continue offering standing ovations? Every single storyteller on that story jam got a standing ovation. It's it was almost right. Like this is where like these things that you start just picking up as a facilitator, you're like, there's something here. It wasn't performative. It wasn't like we have to do this now. There was a holding, right, where the individual story is no longer individual, is woven across the entire group. We become part of it, right? Become part of each other. We are always part of each other, but how these stories remind us, right? That remembering, that reconnection, right? Of like we belong with each other. It's so beautiful and so powerful. And I'll close with this. And I know we're coming to the close too here, but the last piece that I'll offer about the story jam reflections, and this is with the closing IRL gathering. as I was preparing to invite fellows to share for the Story Jam, I brought up a reflection from the scholar and poet Bayo Akomolafe. And Bayo
Mm-hmm.
writes about
Mm-hmm.
how he's wary of doors, right? He says doors are meant to behave, right? Like doors are part of the logic of the system. They're meant to tell us which is the right way through which you enter a space, which is the right way through which you leave a space. They follow the logic of a structure. It's been planned. And that we ought to be wary, right? Like we ought to be critical of the doors that we are told we need to cross. I asked the fellows to take a moment to reflect on what are the doors that you've been told you have to get through to get to where you are today. In and understanding my audience too, right? Like I'm talking to a lot of people who work in academic settings, a lot of people that work in leadership settings, right? Like, and the logic behind it, right? Like, what were you told that you had to do to get through the door? What would make you worthy of going through the door? What would allow you? What do you have to leave behind? What could you bring forward? Like, what? Tell me about that door. I mean, I immediately felt like a reaction to the question. People were just in it, and then on the other end, what Bayo also tells us is, what if instead of paying attention to doors, we paid attention to the cracks?
Mm.
The ruptures in the structure, in the system, those places that shows that our humanity cannot be contained, right? That whatever was built around us, it's clearly not working. And what if we paid attention at the light, right? Or the shadows that are moving through those cracks? And what if we move in that direction with our stories and with our inquiry and with our relationships and with our care? I remember the first time I heard Bayo talk about this and then read more about it. The image that kept coming to me is like whenever I'm walking on a sidewalk and I see the root of a tree just piercing through the concrete, and how that always just oddly, I don't think I had ever quite put a thought around it. More like of an emotion. Like every time I see it, I always feel this like kinship with the tree because I know what it feels like. I know what it feels like to have something pressing hard against you and you're still trying to breathe and move through it. And the brokenness where I like the broken concrete, like how you are blamed for it, like you're the broken thing. And it's really to your point earlier, right, Ashley, around like shifting that narrative is like, I'm not broken.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm not what's broken here. And that sense of restoration that comes from that shift in narrative, right? Through that mirror work, through that critical reflection, through seeing that fractal and within that saying, that is like, I know narrative change is possible because I've experienced it.
Mm-hmm.
I saw that happen with IRL fellows. That gives me hope.
Thank you for sharing that. And can I just, because you had me remembering, and I want to, this is a kudos specifically to the RJ team, because I think that when we talk about where the work that we've done and the narrative change work, what not only where it intersects, but where it meets, is when I came into this space, I think that there was an invitation that I offered to this team about how we could journey in this work, knowing that it would not be easy because what we would have to do, we would have to move from that lens to the mirror, right? And we would have to be accountable to one another about what was showing up in the space. So we had to not only look at what was happening, but we had to look at ourselves and the ways in which we were contributing and or pushing the narrative, right? But part of that also meant that we had to get honest and truthful about not just our individual narratives, but the structural narratives that were present, right? And be willing to shift the both and. And I think that the fellows have been able to experience the depth of what you brought in through narrative change because there was a shift in leadership and their relationship to their stories, to being vulnerable as leadership, because that was not the practice. That sense of being seen, right? Sawabona, to be seen for not just who you are, but all of who you are and where you come from. They had to practice that amongst one another and then make room for fellows to witness and practice it with them. And I think that, and I have to acknowledge that there was a paradigm shift that happened in a short amount of time. And it's not shade to anything, but it's the witnessing that when this leadership decided that they would be willing to engage in a different narrative, then it opened up the portal and the possibility for the healing that took place in the first story jams. Because I don't think that there had to be a different sense of trust present in that room. There had to be a different level of relationality. Because, like I said, no shade. When I went to my first gathering, it was not the conditions that would have allowed that story jam to happen. It was different. And so I want to be able to acknowledge the work that happens individually and structurally, to know that they are all the time, right? It's not just interpersonal, it's always and also structural. That when they shift, this possibility happens. And so I'm grateful for the work that we got to walk and journey through to create the condition for that healing to happen in a greater way. And so I just wanted to name that.
Thank you both. As a checkup, there's so many things that I have experienced through my learning and journey with you both. One thing that I want to bring up is to say sawubona, to say to see you, to see someone, to be seen, and like to experience that like a really physically feel that trust. I don't really think that I have experienced the sense of being seen until I have encountered into these practices with you. And just that, not just, but that experience alone is powerful enough to transform, like make that paradigm shift in somebody, and that's the beginning of the transformation. So I want to offer our checkout question as a wrap up. If you are to speak to the IRL fellows, the alumni, the ones you've met or the ones you haven't, what would your word of encouragement for them in thinking about restorative practices and storytelling in terms of envisioning our future?
I can start, and I want to offer two things. First is the practice of presencing, which I'm sure for the fellows who are listening, who were part of our last session, you might remember how I oftentimes invoke this concept. But I really want to bring us back to the idea of what does it mean to practice presencing, right? And it's the combination of being present and then sensing the highest possible future. Not as guaranteed, but as possible. I do believe that one of the most critical practices that we are going to have to completely commit ourselves to navigate the present and the polycrisis, right? Like the separation of self from self, the ongoing separation between people, between ourselves and nature, right? Like it's gonna require us to bring our entire selves to a deep belief and commitment to presencing the highest future that it's possible through our efforts and holding space with each other to envision that, to dream at a time when everything feels like we should be just rooted in the present. It's going to require work and commitment. And I remind us that it is entirely possible for us to do that. It is entirely possible for us to hold past, to hold present, and to hold future. I know this because I've seen it. Our ancestors did it, thinking 7 generations ahead. What do we need to be doing right now to make what's next possible? And within that, love and care to each one of you. Love, and care. I'm here with you. Um, Whenever we cross paths again in person, just know that in me, you have someone that's wholeheartedly committed to your humanity and everything that's happening in this world. It's very much present in my life in very intimate ways, and love and care to each one of you. I'm here with you. We're not alone. That will be my closing offering.
Thank you for that. I would leave with them and share that to you, I would tell the fellows that you are somebody's Sankofa. You will be somebody's ancestor. So when we talk about 7 generations, most times we don't live to see the 7 generations forward. And so what are you willing to do today? As Luis said, to have something different happen 7 generations from now. And also, like, what are you remembering? Right? What are you remembering to pass forward? What are you needing to reimagine? Right? Because everything that gets passed to us don't need to get passed down. Sometimes we have to reimagine something different. And what are you restoring? Right? Just because you get a story doesn't mean that it has to stay the same. And so, what are you and how are you rewriting a different narrative? Right? That's your responsibility. And I think about the words of our now ancestor, Asada Shakur, when she talks about revolution is love. And I'll leave this with the fellows. We need a revolution of the mind. We need a revolution of the heart. We need a revolution of the spirit. The power of the people is stronger than any weapon. A people's revolution can't be stopped. We need to be weapons of mass construction, weapons of mass love. It's not enough just to change the system. We need to change ourselves. We have got to make this world user-friendly. Ashe.
Thank you so much to you both for sharing your experience, your stories, sharing with us some critical lessons for the times that we're experiencing right now. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for your kindness and your generosity. Thank you for everything that you have done to, make the world a better place for 7 generations hence. We are so deeply grateful for your time and for your work with us. So thank you for being with us today. Thank you for the reminder that the future is not just something that we enter, it is something that we are creating, and that we create one story and one relationship at a time. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to Promising Practices for Health Equity. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with a friend, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Links and resources discussed are going to be available in our show notes. That's all for this episode. Thank you again for joining us on this journey where every step we take together brings us closer to a healthier, more just world. Until next time, take care.
Promising Practices for Health Equity is produced by the Interdisciplinary Research Leaders Program, a national leadership program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. A special thanks to our guests, our production team at Studio Americana, and to you, our listeners, for being a part of this important conversation.